A mansion, a reclusive family, and a woman determined to start over. Emily only wants a fresh chance, but as she crosses the gates of the Alenkar mansion, she realizes she's facing something much bigger than she expected. Between secrets and challenges, her courage will be put to the test. The shrill sound of the alarm clock broke the silence of the small apartment on the east side of Chicago. Emily Thompson opened her eyes slowly, feeling the weight of another sleepless night. Beside her, Ethan, her 6-year-old son, was still fast asleep, wrapped in his favorite superhero patterned blanket. She watched the child's serene face for a few moments, allowing herself a brief smile before facing the reality that awaited her. Careful not to wake her son, Emily got up and walked to the small kitchen. The calendar, hanging on the fridge, marked yet another decisive day, her last job interview of the week. After being let go from the public hospital where she worked as a nursing technician due to budget cuts, her life had turned into a race against time. The bills piled up on the table, and the overdue rent weighed on her conscience like an anchor. As she prepared a simple breakfast, bread with butter and chocolate milk for Ethan, Emily mentally reviewed the details of the ad she had found the night before. A position for a private caregiver, with a salary well above the market average. It seemed too good to be true, but she couldn't afford to waste any opportunity. "Mommy?" Ethan's sleepy voice brought her back to reality. The boy stood at the kitchen door, his brown hair messy and his eyes still heavy with sleep. "Good morning, sweetheart," Emily smiled, pouring milk into her son's favorite mug. "Did you sleep well?" Ethan nodded, sitting at the table. "Are you going to work today?" The innocent question made her heart tighten. "Not exactly. I'm going for a job interview. Mrs. Mary is going to look after you today, okay?" The boy made a face. It wasn't that he didn't like the neighbor. Mrs. Mary was a lovely lady who always had homemade cookies saved for him, but Ethan missed spending more time with his mum. "I promise I won't be long," Emily assured, kissing the top of her son's head. "And who knows, maybe this interview will work out, huh?" After leaving Ethan with Mrs. Mary, Emily took 2 buses to reach the Beverly Hills neighborhood. The contrast between her reality and that world of mansions and imported cars couldn't be greater. Following the directions on her phone's GPS, she finally found the address: the Alenkar Mansion, an imposing property surrounded by high walls and a meticulously maintained garden. As she rang the intercom, Emily nervously adjusted the blazer she had borrowed from an old colleague at the hospital. A formal female voice answered, asking for her identification. Seconds later, the main gate opened with an electronic buzz. The path to the main entrance was paved with cobblestones, flanked by flower beds of exotic plants. A marble fountain gushed crystal-clear water in the center of the front garden. Emily took a deep breath, trying to control the growing anxiety in her chest. At the door, a middle-aged woman, dressed in an impeccable business suit, was waiting for her. "Miss Thompson? I'm Helen Smith, the house supervisor. Please follow me." The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than its facade. Italian marble floors, artwork adorning the walls, furniture that looked like it had been plucked from a luxury decor catalogue. Helen led Emily through several rooms until they reached a library that seemed straight out of a movie. "Please wait. Here. Mr. Alenkar will see you in a few minutes," Helen instructed, leaving Emily alone in the lavish space. As she waited, Emily observed the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound books. Some framed photographs caught her attention. They showed a tall, athletic man in various situations, at conferences, engaging in extreme sports, piloting a helicopter. She recognized the face from the news articles she had researched online. Richard Alenkar, the owner of the mansion. The sound of a door opening made Emily turn. A man in a motorized wheelchair entered the library, followed by a woman who appeared to be a few years older than him. The contrast between the photos on the walls and the man before her was striking. Richard Alenkar still carried traces of the successful businessman from the photographs, but something in his eyes had changed. There was a hardness there, a bitterness that hadn't been present in the images. "Miss Thompson," his voice was deep and controlled, "this is my sister, Isabella Alenkar. She will be joining us for this interview." Isabella, a successful lawyer, well known in Chicago's business circles, simply nodded briefly, her eyes studying Emily with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Please, have a seat," Richard gestured to a leather armchair. "Helen informed me that you have experience as a nursing technician." "Yes, sir," Emily replied, maintaining an upright posture. "I worked for 6 years at the East Side Municipal Hospital." "And why did you leave?" "Budget cuts. The hospital had to reduce its staff." Richard exchanged a glance with his sister before continuing. "I see. And do you have experience with patients in a similar condition to mine?" "Yes. During my time at the hospital, I worked in the rehabilitation wing. I have experience with various levels of spinal cord injuries and the necessary care." "I don't need pity," Richard cut in, his voice sharp. "I need someone competent who will do their job without treating me like an invalid." Emily held his gaze. "Mr. Alencar, my job is to help people maintain their independence and dignity. I don't offer pity. I offer professionalism." Something in her direct response seemed to surprise Richard. He shifted slightly in his chair, studying Emily more closely. "The job requires full dedication," Isabella intervened. "You'll need to live here. Will that be a problem?" Emily hesitated for a moment, thinking of Ethan. "I have a 6-year-old son." "That's not acceptable," Richard began, but Isabella cut him off. "The house has an independent service wing," she pondered. "It could be adapted." A tense silence settled in the library. Richard seemed to be waging an internal battle, his fingers drumming on the arm of his wheelchair. 3 months on trial," he finally declared. "If it doesn't work out, we go our separate ways. The salary will be as advertised with all legal benefits. Helen will show you your accommodations and explain your duties." Emily could hardly believe it. It was more than she had hoped for, more than she had dreamed of during the weeks of constant worry. "Thank you, Mr. Alencar. You won't regret it." "We'll see," he replied curtly, maneuvering his wheelchair toward the door. "Helen!" The supervisor appeared almost instantly. "Yes, sir?" "Show Miss Thompson her accommodations and arrange the necessary paperwork. She starts tomorrow." As she followed Helen through the mansion's hallways, Emily felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She had gotten the job, but something told her the next few months would be far more challenging than she imagined. Her thoughts turned to Ethan. At least now she could secure a better future for her son. What Emily didn't know was that this day would mark only the beginning of a journey that would transform not just her life, but also the lives of everyone around her. The Alencar mansion held secrets, untold stories, and wounded hearts in need of healing. And perhaps, just perhaps, she was exactly the person that place needed. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit like. Tell us which city you're watching from and stay tuned. The first week at the Alencar mansion was a true test for Emily. Adapting to the new routine required more than professional competence. It demanded an emotional strength she didn't know she possessed. The day invariably began at 6 in the morning, when she had to prepare Richard's medications and organize his physical therapy schedule and other activities. Ethan, surprisingly, adapted more easily to the change. The small service wing Helen had prepared for them was much more spacious than their old apartment, and the boy was delighted with the vast garden where he could play. Mrs. Mary, who had formed a strong bond with the boy, offered to continue caring for him during the day now as the official nanny hired by the Alencar family, a suggestion that unexpectedly came from Isabella. "Your son is a lovely boy," Helen commented one morning as she guided Emily through Richard's breakfast preferences. "Very polite for his age." Emily smiled proudly. "I try to do my best in raising him." "Mr. Richard sometimes watches him from the office window," Helen revealed, lowering her voice. "I think having a child around brings something different to this house." Indeed, the mansion seemed like a place steeped in silent sadness. The staff, though efficient, moved like shadows through the hallways, always trying to go unnoticed. Richard rarely left his quarters or the office, and when he did, it was always with a closed-off expression that discouraged any attempt at approach. On the morning of the third day, Emily had her first serious clash with him. Richard refused to take one of the medications prescribed by the doctor, claiming that the medicine made him drowsy. "Mr. Alencar," Emily kept her voice firm, This medication is essential to prevent muscle spasms. We can't simply ignore the doctor's prescription. I don't need you to tell me what to do, he retorted, his eyes flashing with irritation. I already said I won't take it. All right, she replied, surprising him. I'll record your refusal in the daily report and inform your doctor, but I need you to sign a liability waiver. Richard stared at her, clearly not expecting that reaction. Are you always this inflexible? No, sir, I'm professional. There's a difference. For a moment, Emily thought she saw a flicker of amusement in his eyes, but it was so quick she might have imagined it. Fine, he finally conceded. Give me that damn medicine. Small victories like this began to accumulate over the days. Emily learned to read Richard's moods, to identify when he needed space and when, though he would never admit it, he needed company. One afternoon, while organizing medical documents in the office, Emily noticed a folder with old news clippings. They were stories about the helicopter accident that had changed Richard's life. The images showed the wreckage of the aircraft and sensationalist headlines about the miracle that had kept the businessman alive. Curiosity is a dangerous quality for an employee. Isabella's voice startled her. The lawyer stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Sorry, Emily began to put the clippings away, but Isabella stopped her. No, perhaps you really need to understand. She approached, picking up one of the clippings. Richard was a different man before the accident. Dynamic, cheerful, full of plans. He and Patricia were going to get married in 3 months. Patricia? Your fiancée at the time, a talented, ambitious architect, and a coward. Isabella's tone was heavy with bitterness. She promised to stand by him during his recovery, but she couldn't handle the pressure. She left for an international project less than 2 months after the accident. Emily felt a lump in her throat. It must have been very hard for him. It was more than hard, it was devastating. Richard not only lost the mobility of his legs, he lost his trust in people. Since then, he's closed himself off, pushed friends away, and dedicated himself solely to business, turning the company into his only connection to the outside world. Emily reflected on that information. Suddenly, many things made sense. The constant bitterness, the resistance to accepting help, the fear of showing any kind of vulnerability. Why are you telling me this? She asked, genuinely curious. Isabella sighed, putting the article back in the folder. Because you're different from the other caregivers who've been here. You're not afraid of him. You don't let him intimidate. And more importantly, you treat my brother like a person, not a patient. Before Emily could respond, they heard voices coming from the garden. It was Ethan, playing with a remote-controlled car while Mrs. Mary watched him. The sound of a child's laughter echoed through the mansion, bringing a lightness long forgotten in that environment. Your son, Isabella began, looking out the window. He reminds me of Richard when he was a child. The same energy, the same curiosity. At that moment, as if he had heard them talking about him, Richard appeared in his motorized wheelchair at the other end of the garden. He stopped, watching Ethan play. The boy, noticing him, waved enthusiastically. Hi, Uncle Richard, Ethan shouted, surprising both Emily and Isabella with the naturalness of the address. To everyone's astonishment, Richard responded with a slight nod before retreating. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but for those who knew Richard, Alencar, it represented a significant change in his usual behavior. Interesting, Isabella murmured, more to herself than to Emily. The following days brought a more established routine to the mansion. Emily began to notice small changes in Richard's behavior. He still maintained his distant and sometimes harsh demeanor, but he no longer completely rejected attempts at interaction. During the physical therapy sessions, which took place in a specially equipped room on the ground floor of the mansion, Emily noticed that he was starting to open up a little more. Between exercises, Richard occasionally asked questions about Ethan, showing a discreet interest in the boy's life. Does he not have a father? He asked once, while Emily assisted him with muscle-strengthening exercises. No, she replied simply. It's just the two of us. Richard fell silent for a few moments as if processing the information. That must be hard. Sometimes. But Ethan is a good boy. He brings me more joy than worries. Did you work throughout your pregnancy? Yes, up until the last month. And I went back as soon as my leave ended. I had no choice. Bills don't wait. Something in her response seemed to touch Richard. He remained thoughtful for the rest of the session, less resistant to the exercises than usual. The following week, during breakfast, Helen brought news that caught Emily by surprise. Mr. Richard has requested that we prepare the paperwork to enroll Ethan at St. Clara School, the supervisor informed her, handing over a folder with forms. It's one of the best schools in the area, just 10 minutes from here. Emily was speechless. St. Clara School was known for its excellent education and its exorbitant tuition fees completely out of her reach. But I can't afford it. All expenses will be covered by the Alencar family, Helen explained. It's part of your benefits as a live-in employee. Dr. Isabella has already arranged the contract. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Emily found Richard in his office. He was standing by the window, gazing at the illuminated garden. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me," he replied without turning around. "It's just a practical matter. If you're going to work here, your son needs a good education." But Emily knew there was more to it than practicality. Little by little, the walls Richard had built around himself were beginning to show small cracks. What neither of them realized was that these subtle changes were just the beginning. The presence of Emily and Ethan was slowly transforming the atmosphere of the Alencar mansion, bringing color back to a world that had long existed only in shades of gray. However, not everything would be so simple. The next morning, an unexpected visit would bring to light ghosts from the past that Richard had struggled to keep buried. Patricia Anderson had returned to Chicago, and her first stop would be none other than the Alencar mansion. The morning began like any other at the Alencar mansion. Emily had just finished assisting Richard with his morning bath and was accompanying him to the breakfast room when the sound of high heels on the marble floor caught their attention. Helen appeared hurried, her usual composure slightly shaken. "Mr. Richard," she began hesitantly, "Miss Anderson is here." The effect of the announcement was immediate. Richard stiffened in his chair, his fingers tightening around the controls. For a moment, Emily thought he would simply turn around and retreat to his quarters, as he often did when situations displeased him. However, he remained where he was, his expression transforming into a mask of studied indifference. "Let her in." His voice came out controlled, almost cold. Emily made a move to leave, but Richard stopped her with a gesture. "Stay, I'll need my medication soon." Patricia Anderson appeared at the door like a vision from the pages of a fashion magazine. Tall, elegant, impeccably dressed in an Italian, tailored suit, she exuded a confidence that seemed to fill the entire room. Her intense green eyes quickly scanned the room before settling on Richard. "Richard," her voice was soft, melodious. "It's been a while." "Not long enough, apparently," he replied dryly. "To what do I owe the honor?" Patricia smiled, seemingly immune to the hostility. "Can't I visit an old friend?" Her eyes then turned to Emily, assessing her with calculated interest. "Aren't you going to introduce me to your employee?" "Emily Thompson, my caregiver," Richard replied mechanically. "Emily, this is Patricia Anderson." "His ex-fiancée," Patricia added, extending her hand to Emily with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Though I imagine you already know that." Emily accepted the greeting with professional politeness, noting the way Patricia emphasized the word ex-fiancé. There was something predatory in her demeanor, as if every gesture was carefully calculated to produce a specific effect. "Actually," Patricia continued, sitting down uninvited, "my visit has a professional purpose. I'm representing Phoenix Construction in a partnership proposal." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Phoenix? I thought you were working in Dubai." "I was, but I received an interesting offer to return to Brazil. Phoenix is expanding its operations, and," she paused deliberately, "I heard that Alencar Construction is facing some challenges in the market." "We're perfectly fine," Richard cut in. "If you came here to—" "I came to propose a merger," Patricia interrupted, leaning slightly forward. "Phoenix has capital and international connections. Alencar has tradition and an enviable client portfolio. Together, we could dominate the market." Emily watched the interaction with growing discomfort. There was something about the way Patricia addressed Richard, a mix of condescension and false concern that deeply unsettled her. "I need my medication now," Richard declared abruptly, turning his chair toward the door. "Emily?" "Of course, sir," she replied promptly, relieved by the opportunity to escape the tense atmosphere. As they walked down the hallway, Emily could feel Patricia's gaze burning into her back. In the office, Richard seemed tense, his breathing slightly altered. "Are you okay?" Emily asked, concerned about his vital signs. "I'm fine," he replied curtly, but then softened his tone. "I just need a moment." Emily nodded, busying herself with preparing the medication in silence. After a few minutes, Richard spoke again, his voice more controlled. "She hasn't changed a bit," he commented, more to himself than to Emily. "The same old game." "What game?" Richard looked at her, surprised by the direct question. Patricia has always been an expert at identifying weaknesses and using them to her advantage. That's how she got where she is. "And what does she think your weakness is now?" A bitter smile appeared on Richard's lips. "She thinks I'm the same devastated man she left 2 years ago, someone easy to manipulate." Before Emily could respond, Isabella burst into the office, her heels echoing loudly on the wooden floor. "How dare she?" The lawyer was visibly upset. "Showing up like this without warning, with this absurd proposal." "Did you know she was back?" Richard questioned. "I heard rumors last week," Isabella admitted. "Phoenix has been making aggressive moves in the market, but I never imagined they would have the audacity to come here." "She's always had plenty of audacity," Richard commented, his voice dripping with irony. At that moment, Ethan appeared at the office door, his eyes shining with excitement. Mom, Mrs. Mary let me feed the fish in the pond." The sudden presence of the child broke the tension in the room. Surprisingly, Richard was the first to react. "You have to be careful near the pond, kid," he warned, his tone softer than Emily had ever heard. "Those fish are smarter than they look." Ethan walked over to Richard's chair, completely at ease. "You have so many different fish there. Some are orange, some are black." "Koi fish," Richard explained. "They're Japanese, each color has a different meaning." Isabella watched the interaction with interest, while Emily felt something warm in her chest. It was the first time she had seen Richard truly relaxed, almost happy. The moment was interrupted by Helen, who appeared to inform them that Patricia was still waiting for a response regarding the proposal. "Tell her we'll review the documentation and get back to her," Isabella replied before Richard could speak. "And Helen, schedule future meetings by appointment only." After Helen left, Richard remained silent for a few moments, watching Ethan, who was now engrossed in a book about fish he had found on the shelf. "Emily," he finally called, "I need you to do something beyond your usual duties." "What would that be?" "I want you to pay attention to everything that happens in this house over the next few weeks. Patricia didn't come here just for a business proposal. She wants something more, and I need to find out what it is." Emily nodded, understanding the seriousness of the situation. Patricia's return had brought more than painful memories. It had brought a veiled threat that hung in the air like a storm cloud. That night, after putting Ethan to bed, Emily found Isabella in the garden, gazing at the koi pond. "You know what worries me the most?" the lawyer began without preamble. "Richard is right. Patricia always has a plan B, and it's usually something no one expects. Why did she come back now, of all times? That's the question we can't ignore," Isabella sighed. "Alencar Construction is about to close a major government contract for an urban revitalization project. If this contract goes through, we'll become the largest company in the sector in the country. And Phoenix wants a piece of that. Not just a piece, they want it all." Isabella turned to face Emily. "In the last few months, we've lost 3 major contracts to competitors, contracts that were practically guaranteed. Someone has been leaking privileged information. You think that I don't have proof? Not yet. But I've known Patricia long enough to know she doesn't take a step without having the entire board planned out in front of her." The sound of a motorized wheelchair approaching interrupted the conversation. Richard emerged from the shadows of the garden, his face partially illuminated by the decorative lights around the lake. "You should come inside," he warned. "It's getting cold." There was something different in his voice, a determination Emily hadn't heard since she started working there. "Richard," Isabella called, noticing the change. "First thing tomorrow, I want all the files from the last 6 months on my desk," he declared. "Contracts, proposals, everything. If Patricia wants to play, we'll play, but this time we'll be the ones setting the rules." Emily watched as the siblings withdrew, leaving her alone with her thoughts. In just one day, the delicate balance that had been established at the Alencar mansion had been completely disrupted. Now more than ever, she needed to stay alert, not just because it was her job, but because in some way she didn't yet fully understand. She had become part of this story. Upstairs, a light still burned in Richard's office. Through the window, his silhouette could be seen hunched over documents, preparing for a battle that promised to be far more complex than anyone could imagine. The days following Patricia's visit brought a new dynamic to the Alencar mansion. Richard, who had previously spent most of his time secluded in his quarters, now spent hours in his office, analyzing documents and holding video conferences. His determination to uncover what was happening to his company seemed to have awakened something within him, a long dormant energy. Emily noticed the changes not only in his work routine, but also in Richard's behavior. He was more communicative, more present, though he still maintained his reserved nature. During their physical therapy sessions, which had once been marked by tense silence, conversations now flowed on various topics. "How's Ethan adjusting to the new school?" he asked during a particularly intense session of exercises. "Very well," Emily replied, assisting him with the strengthening movements. "The teachers say he's very participative. He made several friends." Richard nodded, satisfied. "He showed me a drawing he made in art class yesterday. A very creative interpretation of the fish pond." Emily smiled, surprised. She didn't know Ethan had shared his drawing with Richard. He's fascinated by those fish. He spends hours watching them whenever he can. "I used to do the same," Richard commented, a nostalgic tone in his voice. "When I was a child, that pond was my refuge. My father used to say that koi fish represent perseverance. They swim against the current, no matter how strong it is." The mention of Richard's father caught Emily's attention. It was the first time he had spoken about his family beyond Isabella. "Did your father build this house?" "Yes, from the ground up. Albert Alencar started as a simple foreman. He built Alencar construction brick by brick, literally." Richard paused, his eyes distant. He didn't accept shortcuts. He said an empire built on weak foundations is destined to collapse. He seemed like a wise man. He was. And he would have hated seeing what's happening to the company now. Richard adjusted his position in the chair, a shadow crossing his face. Someone is trying to destroy everything he built. At that moment, Isabella entered the physical therapy room carrying a thick folder of documents. Her expression was serious. "We need to talk," she announced, "in private." Emily made a move to leave, but Richard stopped her. "She stays. I need her for the exercises anyway." Isabella hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I found something in the old contracts. Over the past 6 months, subtle clauses have been inserted into several documents. They seem harmless when viewed in isolation, but together, they create a significant vulnerability." "What kind of vulnerability?" Richard asked, his voice tense. "In the event of a merger or acquisition, these clauses would allow the new controller unrestricted access to all our patents and construction processes. In other words, whoever buys the company would gain access to decades of knowledge and innovation." Richard visibly paled. "How did this go unnoticed by our legal team?" "Because it was done very cleverly," Isabella explained, spreading some documents on a nearby table. "The changes were inserted into different contracts by different lawyers at different times. It's only when you analyze everything together that the pattern becomes visible." "Edward Mendez," Richard murmured, his face hardening. "He was the only one authorized to approve contract changes besides you." Isabella nodded gravely. "Our legal director, who conveniently resigned 2 weeks ago to accept an offer from Phoenix." Emily, who had remained silent, watching the exchange between the siblings, noticed how the pieces were starting to fall into place. "Mrs. Anderson's merger proposal. It wasn't a proposal. It was a trap," Richard finished, his voice heavy with bitterness. They knew that if they secured the merger, they would gain access to everything, all the technical knowledge, all the innovations my father developed over the years. But why now? Emily questioned. Why didn't they try this before? The government contract, Isabella replied. If we secure this urban revitalization project, we'll become practically invincible in the market. Our sustainable construction techniques would be implemented on a large scale, setting a new standard for the industry. Richard maneuvered his chair to the window, looking out at the garden where Ethan was playing under Mrs. Mary's supervision. Patricia always knew this was my father's dream, to develop construction methods that were both efficient and environmentally responsible. And she used that knowledge against you, Emily concluded, feeling a wave of indignation rise in her chest. Not just that, Isabella added, her voice trembling slightly. She waited until Richard was most vulnerable. After the accident, during the company's restructuring, many documents were reviewed and updated. It was the perfect time to insert those changes without raising suspicions. A heavy silence fell over the room. Emily noticed how tense Richard's shoulders were, his hands gripping the arms of the chair tightly. She instinctively moved closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. What can we do? The use of "we" didn't go unnoticed by Richard, who looked up to meet her gaze. For a moment, Emily saw not just anger or frustration, but also a renewed determination. We need concrete evidence, he declared. It's not enough to identify the pattern in the clauses. We need to prove there was bad faith, that Edward was acting under Phoenix's direction. That won't be easy, Isabella pondered. Edward was very careful with his communications. But he didn't work alone, Emily interjected. Someone had to have access to the original contracts, someone who could make changes to the documents before they reached his desk. Richard looked at her with renewed interest. His secretary, Marina Torres. She's been with the company for over 15 years and has access to all the files. And she always seemed very close to Edward, Isabella added, her eyes lighting up at the possibility. Maybe too close. I need to talk to her, Richard decided, but I can't draw attention. If Edward or Patricia find out we're investigating, I can help, Emily offered. No one would suspect a caregiver asking casual questions. Richard and Isabella exchanged glances. It's risky, he argued. Riskier is losing everything your father built, Emily countered firmly. Besides, Marina doesn't know me. She'd have no reason to distrust me. After a moment of consideration, Richard nodded. All right, but we need to be very careful. Patricia is dangerous when she feels threatened. How do we proceed? Isabella questioned. First, we need to maintain appearances, Richard explained. I'll request a meeting with the Phoenix team to discuss the merger proposal. That will keep them busy, thinking we're considering the offer. Meanwhile, Emily added, I can start getting closer to Marina, maybe through some event or situation that doesn't raise suspicions. The company anniversary is in 2 weeks, Isabella reminded. Traditionally, we hold a celebration that includes all employees and their families. It would be the perfect opportunity, Richard agreed. We can use the party as cover. Emily could attend as my official companion, since I'll need assistance. During the event, the plan was starting to take shape, but Emily couldn't help feeling a pang of worry. She was about to get involved in something much bigger than her role as a caregiver. Yet as she looked at Richard and saw the mix of determination and vulnerability in his eyes, she knew she couldn't just stand aside. There's one more thing, Isabella added, pulling one last document from the folder. I found records of suspicious bank transfers from an offshore company based in the Cayman Islands. The amounts coincide with the dates of the changes in the contracts. We need to track these transfers, Richard ordered. Isabella, use your contacts in the financial market. The more ammunition we have, the better. At that moment, Ethan rushed into the room, his face lit up with a smile. Mum, look what I found in the garden. In his hands, he held a small turtle. The boy's innocent arrival served as a reminder of what was truly at stake. This wasn't just a corporate battle. It was a fight to preserve a legacy, for justice, and in some way for the family itself. Take her back to the lake, champ, Richard instructed gently. That's where she belongs. As she watched Ethan carefully leave with his discovery, Emily realized that something had irrevocably changed that afternoon. The Alencar mansion, which had once seemed like just her workplace, had now become the center of a battle she also considered her own. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the windows of the physical therapy room. In 2 weeks during the company's anniversary party, they would take the first step in their plan. Until then, they needed to prepare, maintaining appearances while gathering their strength for the clash ahead. "I think that's enough exercises for today," Emily said softly, noticing the fatigue on Richard's face. He nodded, but before she could step away, he took her hand. "Thank you," he said simply, his gaze conveying far more than words ever could. Emily smiled in response, feeling the weight of the trust that had been placed in her. As she helped Richard prepare for dinner, her mind was already working on the details of the plan they would need to execute. One thing was certain: the battle for Alencar Construction was just beginning. The 2 weeks leading up to Alencar Construction's anniversary passed in a whirlwind of activity. The mansion was in constant motion with preparations for the event, which would be held in its gardens. Helen coordinated an expanded team of staff, transforming the already impressive outdoor space into an even more dazzling setting. Emily observed everything with a mix of admiration and apprehension. As she accompanied Richard in his daily routine, she tried to absorb as much information as possible about the company and its employees. Isabella had provided a complete dossier on Marina Torres, Eduardo Mendez's secretary, and Emily discreetly studied her habits and preferences. "She always arrives early at the office," Isabella explained during one of their private conversations. "She likes to organize everything before the other employees arrive, and she has a fairly predictable routine. Breakfast at the ground floor, cafe, lunch always at the same restaurant near the company. Any hobbies or specific interests I could use as a hook?" "Gardening," Richard interjected, surprising both with his knowledge. "She always participates in the neighborhood garden competitions. She's even won a few awards." Emily smiled inwardly. This was exactly the kind of information she needed. The mansion's extensive garden would be a natural topic of conversation during the event. However, the party preparations weren't her only concern. Ethan had started showing signs of restlessness with all the commotion in the house. The boy, usually sociable and cheerful, was quieter than usual. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Emily asked one night as she helped him with his homework. "Are you worried about something?" Ethan bit his lip, hesitant. "It's just, a lot of people are coming to the house, right? Yes, it's going to be a big party. Why? What if they don't like me? What if they think I shouldn't be here?" Emily's heart tightened. Even with all his innocence, Ethan sensed the social differences between them and the world of the mansion. Before she could respond, a familiar voice sounded from the door. "Anyone who doesn't like you will have to deal with me," Richard declared, maneuvering his wheelchair into the room. "This is your home too, champ." Ethan's eyes widened at the statement, a shy smile appearing on his face. "Really, Uncle Richard?" "Absolutely. In fact," Richard continued, exchanging a quick glance with Emily, "I need your help with something very important for the party." "My help?" The boy's interest was immediately captured. "Yes. You know the koi fish pond? We need to make sure it looks especially beautiful for the event. And since you're our resident fish expert," Ethan practically jumped out of his chair with excitement. "I can help. I know everything about the fish. The orange one means luck, the black one protection." "Exactly," Richard smiled, a genuine smile that Emily had noticed appearing more often lately. "How about we start early tomorrow?" After Ethan finally fell asleep, still excited about his new responsibility, Emily found Richard in his office. He was hunched over plans and documents related to the party. "Thank you," she said simply, "for what you did with Ethan." Richard looked up from the papers. "No need to thank me. The boy has a natural gift with those fish. Besides," he paused, "significantly, it will be good to have something to distract him during the event." Emily nodded, understanding the implicit concern. The party would be much more than a celebration. It would be the start of her investigation, and the less Ethan knew about it, the better. Patricia confirmed her attendance, Richard informed, his voice tightening slightly. "Along with the entire board of Phoenix. Does she suspect anything?" "I don't think so. Isabella has been handling the preliminary negotiations for the merger quite convincingly. They think they have us exactly where they wanted. The sound of heels in the hallway announced Isabella's arrival. She entered the office carrying an elegant folder. "The bank transfers," she announced, spreading documents across the table. "I managed to trace some of the money. As we suspected, the offshore company is linked to a former partner of Phoenix." "We need more," Richard declared. "Something that directly connects Edward or Patricia to these transactions." "That's where Marina comes in," Emily observed. "She must have processed the paperwork for these transfers." "Exactly. And knowing Edward, he must have kept records of everything. Men like him always keep insurance." "The problem will be getting Marina to talk," Isabella pondered. "She's extremely loyal to Edward." "Or afraid of him," Emily suggested. "Sometimes loyalty and fear get confused." Richard watched her with interest. "Do you have something in mind?" "Maybe. During the party I can casually mention that I've noticed how tense she seems lately. With the garden as an initial conversation topic, I can subtly steer her toward the subject of work. And if she doesn't open up, then I'll mention that working for someone like you," Emily looked directly at Richard, "has taught me that sometimes we need to choose which side of history we want to be on." A reflective silence fell over the office. The plan was risky, dependent on many variables, but it was the best chance they had. "We need to discuss your presentation for the party." Isabella changed the subject, pulling an envelope from her folder. "I ordered something appropriate for the occasion." Emily opened the envelope, finding photos of an elegant dress in deep blue tones. "Isabella, this is necessary," the lawyer cut in with a smile. "You need to exude credibility. Besides," she cast a meaningful glance at her brother, "I'm sure Richard will appreciate the look." Richard cleared his throat, suddenly very interested in his documents, while Emily felt her cheeks flush. The following days were dedicated to the final preparations. Helen coordinated the setup of the tents in the garden, the installation of the special lighting, and the organization of the buffet. The koi fish pond, under Ethan's enthusiastic supervision, was impeccable, with new aquatic plants and crystal-clear water. On the eve of the event, Emily found Richard alone in the garden, observing the final preparations. The twilight light painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, reflecting off the tranquil surface of the pond. "Nervous?" she asked, stopping beside his chair. "Apprehensive," he corrected. "Tomorrow we start a dangerous game." "We're not playing," Emily replied firmly. "We're fighting for what's right." Richard looked up at her, and for a moment Emily saw something beyond his usual determination. Vulnerability, trust, and something more, something that made her heart beat a little faster. "Mom!" Ethan's voice broke the moment. "Come see." "The fish are doing a dance," Emily smiled, stepping away. "Duty calls." "Emily," Richard called before she got too far. "Thank you for everything." She nodded, understanding everything implied in that gratitude. As she walked toward her son, Emily thought about how her life had changed since she first crossed the gates of the Alenkar mansion. What had started as a necessity for survival had turned into something much deeper. Night fell over Chicago, and with it came the awareness that the next day would mark a point of no return. The board was set, the pieces in place. All that remained was to wait for the right moment to make the first move. The morning of the party dawned with a perfectly blue sky over Chicago, as if nature itself was conspiring for the event's success. From the early hours, the Alenkar mansion buzzed with final preparations. Staff moved with rehearsed precision, adjusting floral arrangements, checking the lighting and finalizing the decoration of the spaces. Emily had woken up before sunrise, her stomach in knots with the anxiety of what was to come. After ensuring Ethan was settled with Mrs. Mary, who would keep him occupied for most of the event, she began her personal preparations. The dress Isabella had chosen was even more impressive in person, a midnight blue silk gown that flowed elegantly, sophisticated without being ostentatious. Emily barely recognized herself when she finally looked in the mirror, her hair and makeup professionally done by a team hired by Isabella. "You look stunning." Helen's voice came from the doorway. "Mister, Richard is waiting for her in the office. Emily found Richard impeccably dressed in a custom-made dark suit. He had trimmed his beard, and his hair was carefully combed, reminiscent of his pre-accident photos. When she entered, he turned his chair and was momentarily speechless. "You look," he began, clearing his throat to steady his voice. "The dress is perfect." "Your sister's doing?" Emily smiled, trying to ignore the warmth rising up her neck under his intense gaze. She thought of everything. "As always," Isabella remarked, entering the room. She looked elegant in a wine-colored pantsuit. "The first guests will start arriving in an hour. Shall we go over the plan one last time?" The three of them sat down, Emily and Isabella in the leather armchairs, while Richard positioned his chair between them. "Marina always arrives early to social events," Isabella began. "She'll likely be among the first guests. Emily, you'll need to approach her before she mingles too much with the others. Use the garden as your initial pretext. She can never resist a conversation about plants." "What about Patricia?" Richard asked, his jaw tightening as he said the name. "She confirmed she'll be coming with Edward," Isabella replied, glancing at her tablet. "They'll probably arrive when the event is in full swing to make their grand entrance." "Typical," Richard muttered. "We need to keep them distracted while Emily does her part." "Leave that to me," Isabella assured. "I've prepared a presentation about the potential merger. It'll keep them occupied for a good while." The sound of arriving cars signaled the start of the event. Helen appeared at the door, indicating that the first guests had arrived. Emily felt her heart race. "Remember," Richard briefly held her hand before she stood up. "You're not alone in this." The mansion's gardens were magnificently decorated. Elegant white tents created comfortable shaded areas, while elaborate floral arrangements were strategically placed throughout the space. The koi pond, thanks to Ethan's care, looked especially beautiful, with floating lanterns that would be lit at dusk. As predicted, Marina Torres was one of the first to arrive. Dressed in understated elegance, she moved through the garden with the familiarity of someone who knew the space well. Emily waited for the right moment to approach. "The hydrangeas are particularly beautiful this year," she commented casually, stopping beside Marina, who was observing one of the flower beds. "Oh yes," Marina replied, her eyes shining with genuine interest. "The acidic soil in this garden is perfect for them. I've tried growing some at home, but I've never achieved such an intense shade of blue." "Do you also enjoy gardening?" Emily asked, as if she didn't know. The conversation flowed naturally from there. Marina was truly passionate about the subject, and little by little began to relax in Emily's presence. They walked through the garden discussing different species and cultivation techniques. "It must be rewarding to work in a place with a garden like this," Emily commented, subtly steering the conversation toward professional territory. Marina hesitated slightly. "Yes, it is. It was. I mean, it still is, but things have changed a lot lately," Marina sighed, her expression darkening. "Ever since Mr. Edward—" At that moment, a commotion at the garden entrance signaled the arrival of new guests. Patricia Anderson made her triumphant entrance, stunning in a red dress, accompanied by Edward Mendez, a tall and elegant man with graying hair at his temples. Marina immediately tensed up. "Excuse me, I need to—" "It must be hard," Emily interrupted, gently, "to carry the weight of certain secrets alone." The secretary froze, her eyes widening slightly. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. And I think it's eating you up inside." Marina cast a nervous glance toward Edward, who was now chatting animatedly with a group of executives. "How you don't understand, you can't understand. I understand perfectly," Emily replied firmly. "I understand what it's like to feel afraid, to feel cornered. But I also understand that we always have a choice." "Choice?" Marina laughed bitterly. "What choice do I have? He has things against me. Documents that you altered under his orders," Emily finished softly. "The construction company contracts." Marina's face paled. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter how we know. What matters is that you have a chance to do the right thing. Mr. Richard can protect you, Marina, but you need to trust him. Tears began to form in the secretary's eyes. "You don't know, Edward. He has proof that I embezzled money from the company years ago. It was just once. I was desperate. My mother needed surgery. He found out, and since then, he's been blackmailing you," Emily concluded, feeling a wave of compassion for the woman. "He made me alter the contracts, insert those clauses. He said if I didn't cooperate, he'd hand over the evidence to the police. I had no choice." "Now you do," Emily said firmly. "Mr. Richard is willing to help you, but we need evidence against Edward and Patricia." Marina hesitated, her gaze shifting between Edward and Emily. I kept copies of everything. Emails, bank transfers, specific instructions about the contract changes. I was afraid he'd turn on me one day too." "Where are these documents?" "On my personal computer at home, in an encrypted folder. We need those files, Marina. This is your chance to break free." The secretary took a deep breath, seeming to make a decision. "Meet me in half an hour by the lake. I'll call my sister. She can access my computer and send everything to a secure email." As Marina hurried away, Emily felt a familiar presence. Behind her, it was Richard, who had discreetly approached during the conversation. "Did you get it?" he asked in a low voice. "Yes. Marina is going to hand over the evidence. She's also a victim in all of this, Richard. Edward has been blackmailing her for years." Richard nodded gravely. "We'll protect her. She'll be a crucial witness." Across the garden, Patricia watched their interaction with growing interest. Her green eyes narrowed slightly as she noticed the closeness and intimacy with which Emily and Richard were speaking. The party continued around them with soft music, lively conversations and laughter. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne, and the sun began to set, creating a spectacle of colors in the Chicago sky. But for Emily, Richard, and Marina, the real drama was just beginning. Half an hour later, as agreed, Emily made her way to the lake. The floating lanterns had been lit, creating an almost magical scene. Marina was already waiting for her, her face pale but determined. "It's done," she said, as soon as Emily approached. "I sent everything to the email Dr. Isabella gave me. There are over 200 files, including recordings of conversations." "Recordings?" "I started recording my meetings with Edward after he forced me to make the first changes. I thought I might need to defend myself someday." "You did the right thing, Marina." "I hope so, because—" She abruptly stopped, her eyes widening as she looked over Emily's shoulder. "What a touching meeting." Patricia's voice sounded behind them, cold as ice. "Too bad it has to be interrupted." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine at the sound of Patricia's voice. Instinctively, she positioned herself between Patricia and Marina, who was visibly trembling. "Patricia!" Emily kept her voice firm, controlled. "The party is happening on the other side of the garden." "Oh, but the real party is happening here, isn't it?" Patricia took a few steps forward, her red dress shimmering under the light of the floating lanterns. A caregiver and a secretary conspiring in the corners. "How interesting." "I don't know what you're talking about," Marina tried to argue, her voice faltering. "Don't be modest, dear Marina. I just received a very interesting call from Edward. It seems that certain files were accessed remotely from your personal computer, files that shouldn't exist." The sound of approaching footsteps made the three women turn. Edward Mendez emerged from the shadows of the garden, his usually composed face twisted into a mask of controlled fury. "Marina." His voice was soft, dangerous. "I thought we had an agreement." "She doesn't owe you any explanations," Emily interjected, her stance firm despite the fear growing in her chest. "The brave caretaker," Patricia smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You must be feeling very proud of yourself, aren't you? You managed to win everyone's trust at the mansion, including poor Richard's. Unlike you, who betrayed that trust," Emily shot back. Patricia's smile faltered for a moment. "You know nothing about me and Richard. I know enough. I know you abandoned him when he needed you most, and now you're trying to steal the company his family built." "Steal is such an ugly word," Edward intervened, taking another step toward them. "We prefer to think of it as a strategic reallocation of resources." "The documents have already been sent." Marina found the courage to speak, her voice gaining strength. All the evidence of your manipulations, the contract alterations, the illegal bank transfers. Edward's face paled slightly. You wouldn't do that? I already did. It's over, Edward. I'm not afraid of you anymore. A tense silence fell over the group, broken only by the soft bubbling of the lake water and the distant music from the party. Patricia was the first to move, pulling her phone from her evening bag. How touching, she said, typing quickly. But do you really think we didn't prepare for this possibility? She looked up, a cruel glint in her eyes. Edward, show them. The lawyer smiled, pulling an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. Marina, dear, remember when you diverted that money for your mother's surgery? Well, that wasn't all we discovered about you. Marina paled. What are you talking about? Your sister, Edward continued, savoring every word. The one who just accessed her computer. It would be a shame if the company she works for found out about certain irregularities in her professional history. Irregularities that could easily lead to serious legal trouble. No, Marina whispered, horrified. My sister has nothing to do with this. Everyone has something to lose, Patricia stated coldly. So it's just a matter of figuring out what. Emily felt her heart pounding in her chest but stood her ground. Do you really think you can keep up this manipulation? That you can get away with everything? And who's going to stop us? Patricia laughed. You? The caregiver who can barely pay her bills? Or Richard, who can hardly get out of that wheelchair? I'd say she's not alone in that assessment. A deep, familiar voice sounded behind them. Richard had quietly approached in his motorized chair, accompanied by Isabella, and to everyone's surprise, two men in discreet suits whom Emily had never seen before. Good evening, Patricia. Isabella stepped forward, her professional tone masking controlled fury. Let me introduce Mr. Paul Mendonça and Mr. Robert Alves from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Edward's face turned completely pale. SEC, but we were contacted by Dr. Isabella a few weeks ago, one of the men explained, his voice serious and professional. The evidence of market manipulation and insider trading is substantial. This is ridiculous, Patricia tried to maintain her composure, but her voice trembled slightly. You have no proof of anything. Actually, Richard interjected, his voice carrying an authority Emily had never witnessed before. We have everything. Every altered document, every suspicious transfer, every recorded conversation. Marina wasn't the only one keeping records, Patricia. What are you talking about? My father always said a good businessman needs to protect himself, Richard D. continued, a slight smile forming on his lips. After the accident when you abandoned me, I started noticing small inconsistencies in the reports. Nothing significant on its own, but together they formed a pattern. So I installed a monitoring system on all the company's computers. You couldn't have, Edward began, but was interrupted by Isabella. Oh, he could and did. Every email you sent, every file you altered, every conversation you had in the office, everything has been recorded. This is illegal, Patricia protested. Actually, one of the investigators intervened, considering there was substantial suspicion of financial crimes and that all employees sign an acknowledgement of corporate equipment monitoring, it is perfectly legal. The sound of more footsteps approaching announced the arrival of two police officers, discreetly dressed in suits to avoid drawing attention from the party guests. Mr. Mendes, one of them addressed Edward, we need you to come with us. We have some questions about certain financial transactions. This is absurd. Edward tried to step back but was gently restrained by the officer. You can't. Yes, they can, Isabella interrupted, her voice tinged with restrained satisfaction. And they will. Say cuss. Emily watched as the officers discreetly escorted Edward out of the garden, while Patricia remained frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. As for you, Richard addressed his ex-fiancée, his voice heavy with old pain finally turning. Into resolve, I suggest you enjoy your freedom while you can. Your emails with Edward are particularly interesting. I'm sure the SEC will have many questions. Richard, Patricia tried one last time, her voice softening. You don't understand. I was only trying to... Enough, he cut her off, raising a hand. It's over, Patricia. This time it's definitely over. The SEC investigators led Patricia out of the garden, leaving a heavy silence in the air. Marina, who had remained in shock throughout the confrontation, finally let out a stifled sob. "It's okay," Emily gently hugged her. "It's over." "Marina," Isabella approached, her voice softer, "we'll need your official statement, but don't worry. You'll have full legal protection, and your sister is safe too. We've already arranged lawyers for both of you." Richard watched the scene with a complex expression on his face, a mix of relief, sadness, and finally freedom. His eyes met Emily's across the group, and in that moment something silent but deeply significant passed between them. The party continued in the distance, the guests oblivious to the drama that had unfolded in the back of the garden. The floating lanterns on the lake continued to glow softly. The koi fish swam in their eternal circular patterns, and the night in Chicago carried on. But for those present in that moment, the world had irrevocably changed. The masks had fallen, the truths had come to light, and with them, the possibility of a new beginning. The days following the confrontation in the garden were intense and transformative for everyone at the Alencar mansion. The headlines in the IC specialized newspapers spoke of nothing else. The attempted hostile takeover of Alencar Construction had been thwarted, and those responsible would face serious legal consequences. Edward Mendez and Patricia Anderson were formally indicted for financial crimes, market manipulation, and insider trading. Phoenix Construction, implicated in the scandal, saw its stock plummet on the exchange, while Alencar Construction emerged stronger from the episode, its transparency and corporate governance praised by the market. In the mansion, a new atmosphere was gradually settling in. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted, allowing everyone to breathe more freely. Richard, in particular, seemed transformed. The bitterness that once dominated his expression had given way to something lighter, closer to the man he used to be before the accident. On a particularly pleasant morning, Emily found him in the garden watching Ethan, who, as usual, was near the koi pond. "He has a special way with them," Richard commented as Emily approached. "The fish seemed to recognize him, just like they recognized you when you were a child," she replied softly. Richard smiled, a genuine smile that now appeared more often. "You know, I spent so much time focused on what I lost that I almost forgot what I still had, what I could still have." His gaze met hers, filled with meaning. Emily felt her heart race, but before she could respond, Isabella appeared, carrying a folder of documents. "Sorry to interrupt," she smiled, noticing the atmosphere between the two. "But we need to discuss a few things. Marina is here." The former secretary of Edward had become a key witness in the case, her testimony and the evidence she provided being crucial to the proceedings. With the legal assistance promised by Isabella, she and her sister were protected from any retaliation. "Come in," Richard invited, maneuvering his chair toward the office. "Ethan, don't wander too far from the pond." "Okay, Uncle Richard," the boy replied, completely absorbed in his task of feeding the fish. In the office, Marina seemed lighter, though the marks of the tension from the past few years still lingered on her face. "The investigators have finished analyzing all the files," she began, her voice firmer than Emily remembered. "The evidence is irrefutable. Edward can't escape this time." "What about Patricia?" Emily couldn't help but ask. "The recordings of their conversations are particularly revealing," Isabella replied, flipping through some documents. "She not only knew everything but was the mastermind behind the plan. She had been plotting this since before she left Richard." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard remained still in his chair, absorbing the information. "Are you okay?" Emily asked gently. "Actually," he replied after a moment, "I am. It's as if a cycle has finally closed. Like I can really move forward now." "What about the company?" Marina questioned. "I heard you won the contract for the urban revitalization project." "Yes," Isabella confirmed, a proud smile on her face. "The board was impressed with our proposal to use sustainable construction techniques. It was our father's dream, and we're finally making it happen." "But that's not all," Richard added, his tone more animated. "We're restructuring the entire company. New governance policies, greater transparency, a training program for young engineers. And, Isabella interrupted with a meaningful smile, a new social project that I think will interest both of you very much. She pulled a different folder from her bag, handing it to Richard. Emily watched as he opened the document, his eyes quickly scanning the content. "It's perfect," he declared after a moment. "Emily, we need your opinion on this." "My opinion?" she asked, stepping closer to examine the documents. The project was ambitious. Alencar Construction planned to establish a rehabilitation and vocational training center, specifically aimed at people with disabilities and their families. The center would offer not only cutting-edge medical treatment, but also vocational courses and job opportunities. The idea is to transform part of the mansion into the center, Isabella explained. The space is more than enough, and we already have all the basic infrastructure needed. The gardens would be maintained and expanded, creating a therapeutic environment. "And we'd like you to lead the project," Richard added, watching Emily's reaction closely. "Your experience as a nursing technician, combined with your management skills and empathy, would be invaluable." Emily felt her eyes fill with tears. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Marina interjected softly. "You've more than proven your competence, and more importantly, you've shown that you truly care about people." "The center would also include a special school," Isabella continued. "Ethan could continue studying here alongside other children. We want to create a truly inclusive environment." Emily looked out the office window, where she could see her son still entertained by the koi fish. Over the past few months, she had witnessed a transformation not only in Richard and the mansion, but also in Ethan. The boy was more confident, happier. "When would we start?" she asked, a smile forming on her lips. Richard smiled in response, relief evident on his face. "The adaptation work begins next month. We want to inaugurate the center by the end of this year." "We already have a considerable waiting list," Isabella added. "Apparently, there's a huge demand for a service like this." "What about your physical therapy?" Emily asked Richard. "Well, I think I'll need a technical supervisor to track my progress," he replied, his eyes sparkling with a humor that once seemed impossible. "Someone who isn't afraid to challenge me when necessary." The sound of children's laughter interrupted the conversation. Ethan had run into the office, his eyes shining with excitement. "Mom, Uncle Richard, you have to see this, the orange fish, it jumped, it was amazing." "That must be a sign of good luck," Richard commented, recalling the ancient Japanese traditions about koi fish. "What do you say, champ? Want to help us build something special here?" Ethan looked curiously at the adults. "Like what?" "A place where people can recover and start over," Emily explained softly. "Like we did." The boy considered the idea for a moment, his expression surprisingly serious. "Are we going to keep living here?" "If your mum agrees," Richard replied, exchanging a meaningful glance with Emily. "You're more than welcome to make the mansion your permanent home." Emily's heart raced at the double meaning of those words. Over the past few months, her relationship with Richard had evolved in ways she hadn't expected. What had started as a professional relationship had deepened into something more profound, more meaningful. "So, Emily," Richard asked gently, "what do you say?" She looked around, at Ethan, who was practically bouncing with excitement, at Marina, who smiled encouragingly, at Isabella, who couldn't hide her satisfied expression, and finally at Richard, whose eyes conveyed far more than words ever could. "I say it's time for a fresh start," she replied, her voice steady yet emotional. "For all of us." The afternoon sun streamed through the office windows, bathing the room in a golden glow. Outside, the koi fish continued their eternal swim in the pond, living symbols of perseverance and transformation. The Alencar mansion, once a place of loneliness and bitterness, was about to become a center of hope and renewal. And for Emily and Richard, it was just the beginning of a new journey, one that promised to be even more extraordinary than the last. Because sometimes, the most unlikely fresh starts are exactly the ones that lead us to the most surprising destinations. A year had passed since the dramatic events that transformed the Alenkar mansion and the lives of everyone involved. The Alenkar Rehabilitation and Training Center was about to complete 6 months of operation, and its results were exceeding all initial expectations. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation and bitterness, now pulsed with renewed energy. The gardens, expanded and adapted, served as a therapeutic space for dozens of patients. The koi fish pond, always the spiritual heart of the place, had been integrated into the rehabilitation program, its tranquil waters providing the perfect environment for meditation and recovery sessions. Emily observed this transformation with a mix of pride and admiration. As the general coordinator of the center, she had been involved in every step of the process, from the initial planning to the implementation of the programs. Her experience as a nursing technician, combined with her natural leadership abilities, had proven essential to the project's success. That particular morning, she walked through the center's hallways, checking the preparations for a special event, the graduation of the first class from the professional training program. 20. Students, all with different types of disabilities, had completed courses in technology, administration, and design. "Have the certificates arrived?" she asked Helen, who continued to manage the logistics of the place with her characteristic efficiency. "Yes, they're all organized, and the buffet is confirmed for 6 p.m. Helen paused, a subtle smile on her lips. "Mr. Richard is especially looking forward to tonight," Emily nodded, understanding the reason well. Among the graduates was John Paul, a young architect who had lost the use of his legs in a work accident. Under Richard's personal mentorship, he had developed a revolutionary project for adapting urban spaces for people with disabilities, a project that would be implemented by Alenkar Construction next year. "Mom!" Ethan's voice echoed down the hallway. The boy, now 7 years old, came running toward her, followed by a group of children from the school integrated into the center. "Slow down, young man," she warned, though she smiled. "What is it?" "The teacher let us help decorate the hall. Come see." Emily followed her son to the large hall where the ceremony would take place. The space, once used only for the Alenkar family's social events, had been completely remodeled. Now large windows allowed abundant natural light to flood in, and access ramps ensured mobility for all users. The children had helped create decorative panels with messages of hope and overcoming. Ethan, in particular, had dedicated himself to a special drawing, a representation of the koi fish swimming against the current, very similar to the one Richard kept framed in his office. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she praised, noticing how her son had perfectly captured the symbolism of the fish. "Uncle Richard said it's like the people here at the center," Ethan explained with the wisdom of children. "They keep swimming, even when it's hard." The sound of a motorized wheelchair announced Richard's arrival. In recent months, thanks to an intensive physical therapy program and his own renewed determination, he had regained some movement in his legs. Although he still relied on the wheelchair for longer distances, he could now take a few steps with the aid of crutches. "And he is absolutely right," Richard commented, approaching them. His face, once marked by lines of bitterness, now displayed a serenity that Emily still found herself admiring. "The preparations are almost ready," she informed him. "John Paul wants to show you the final version of his presentation before the ceremony." "Excellent. But before," he gave a meaningful look to Ethan, "how about showing your mum what we've been practicing?" The boy practically jumped with excitement. Now is as good a time as any." Emily watched curiously as Richard maneuvered his chair into a more suitable position and, with the help of his crutches, carefully stood up. Ethan immediately positioned himself by his side, offering additional support as clearly rehearsed. "Richard, what?" Her words were cut off when he, with slow but steady steps and with Ethan's proud support, walked toward her. Upon reaching her, Richard did something that left Emily breathless. With a practiced motion, he transferred one of the crutches to Ethan's hand and, maintaining his balance, knelt on one knee. "Emily Thompson," he began, his voice filled with emotion, "when you first entered this mansion, I was a man lost in his own bitterness. You not only helped me regain my physical mobility, but also taught me how to walk through life again." Tears began to form in Emily's eyes as Richard pulled a small box from his jacket pocket. "You and Ethan brought light back into this house, into my life. And now, with this center, we're helping others find their own way back to the light." He opened the box, revealing a delicate ring with a blue stone that resembled the color of the koi fish pond. "You are already my family in my heart. Now, I would like to make it official. Emily, would you marry me?" The hall, which Emily hadn't even noticed, was filled with staff and patients from the center, collectively held their breath. Ethan, still firmly holding the crutch, was practically vibrating with contained happiness. "Yes," she replied, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Applause and cheers of congratulations erupted throughout the hall. Richard, with the help of Ethan and Emily, stood up, and the couple's first kiss as fiancé was met with even more celebration. "Now we're officially a family," Ethan declared, hugging both of them. Isabella, who had watched everything from a discreet distance, approached with teary eyes. "Dad would be so proud," she said, hugging her brother. "Of all of this, the center, the company, your happiness." The news of the engagement added an extra layer of celebration to that night's graduation ceremony. John Paul, during his speech, as class valedictorian, perfectly summed up the general sentiment. "The Alencar Center has taught us that transformation is more than physical change. It's a journey of the spirit. Just like the koi fish swimming in our pond, we've learned that true strength isn't about having no obstacles, but about continuing to swim despite them. And sometimes, on that journey, we find people who not only help us swim, but teach us to fly." Later, when the party had ended and the mansion returned to its nighttime tranquility, Emily, Richard, and Ethan were sitting by the edge of the pond. The floating lanterns cast a soft glow on the water, where the koi fish continued their eternal swim. "You know," Ethan commented, his head resting on his mom's shoulder, "I think the fish are happy today." "Why do you think that, champ?" Richard asked. "Because now they have a complete family to care for them." Emily felt her heart fill with love as she watched her son and her fiancé. Life had presented her with challenges that seemed insurmountable, but like the koi fish in the pond, she had swum against the current and found not just survival, but true happiness. The Alencar mansion, once a symbol of isolation, was now a beacon of hope for many. And for Emily, Richard, and Ethan, it was the place where their destinies intertwined in a story of resilience, transformation, and above all, love. As the stars sparkled in the Chicago sky, the newly official family stayed by the pond, sharing dreams and plans for the future. A future that, like the waters of the koi pond, promised to be full of life, movement, and endless possibilities. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Emily, Richard, and Ethan has touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally transformative stories. Find it here by clicking to your left. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on the video. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity and beauty of life. Share your own stories of resilience and transformation in the comments. Together we can inspire and be inspired. Until next time, a mansion, a reclusive family, and a woman determined to start over. Emily only wants a fresh chance, but as she crosses the gates of the Alencar mansion, she realizes she's facing something much bigger than she expected. Between secrets and challenges, her courage will be put to the test. The shrill sound of the alarm clock broke the silence of the small apartment on the east side of Chicago. Emily Thompson opened her eyes slowly, feeling the weight of another sleepless night. Beside her, Ethan, her 6-year-old son, was still fast asleep, wrapped in his favorite superhero patterned blanket. She watched the child's serene face for a few moments, allowing herself a brief smile before facing the reality that awaited her. Careful not to wake her son, Emily got up and walked to the small kitchen. The calendar, hanging on the fridge, marked yet another decisive day, her last job interview of the week. After being let go from the public hospital where she worked as a nursing technician due to budget cuts, her life had turned into a race against time. The bills piled up on the table and the overdue rent weighed on her conscience like an anchor. As she prepared a simple breakfast, Bread with butter and chocolate milk for Ethan. Emily mentally reviewed the details of the ad she had found the night before. A position for a private caregiver, with a salary well above the market average. It seemed too good to be true, but she couldn't afford to waste any opportunity. "Mommy?" Ethan's sleepy voice brought her back to reality. The boy stood at the kitchen door, his brown hair messy and his eyes still heavy with sleep. "Good morning, sweetheart," Emily smiled, pouring milk into her son's favorite mug. "Did you sleep well?" Ethan nodded, sitting at the table. "Are you going to work today?" The innocent question made her heart tighten. "Not exactly."